What activities do Muslims typically do in and around the mosque?
Throughout history and in many parts of the world, mosques have stood at the center of an enormous range of activities. In Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and India, for example, mosque complexes have combined educational facilities of various levels, libraries, medical schools, and hospitals, social service facilities, funerary facilities, and religious residences. Many of the monumental complexes depended on the sort of equally monumental royal patronage that is rare these days. But plans for somewhat less ambitious projects are afoot now in various parts of the United States. As local communities grow, mosque complexes will become increasingly visible. Meeting and social spaces are just the first of many needs beyond the basic requirement of a place for communal ritual prayer.
What activities do Muslims typically do in and around the mosque?
Throughout history and in many parts of the world, mosques have stood at the center of an enormous range of activities. In Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and India, for example, mosque complexes have combined educational facilities of various levels, libraries, medical schools, and hospitals, social service facilities, funerary facilities, and religious residences. Many of the monumental complexes depended on the sort of equally monumental royal patronage that is rare these days. But plans for somewhat less ambitious projects are afoot now in various parts of the United States. As local communities grow, mosque complexes will become increasingly visible. Meeting and social spaces are just the first of many needs beyond the basic requirement of a place for communal ritual prayer.
What are the main Islamic notions of the afterlife?
Muslim eschatology has much in common with most Christian and some Jewish traditions about the afterlife. Death is not the end of life, but a transition to another level of existence. Muslims believe human beings are accountable for all of their free moral decisions. People are not held similarly responsible for actions with negative consequences but done under duress or in the absence of intent to do evil. Numerous texts of the Quran warn of the coming day of judgment. The day of resurrection, the hour in which the true quality of everyone's deeds will be revealed. On the basis of that accounting, individuals will go across a narrow passage of no return called the Barzakh, pronounced Barzakh, to one of several destinations. Paradise is called the garden, Jannah, pronounced Jannah. A verdant place of repose and delight, an oasis for the just. Heaven is not so much literally a place as a state of being whose principal feature is the vision of God. Quranic texts refer to several different levels or degrees of heavenly reward. Hell, known as the fire or Gehenna. Jahannam, pronounced Jahanam, represents the state of refusal to acknowledge God's sovereignty. Some Muslim theologians have taught that hell is not necessarily a permanent state. Since God can always forgive any sin except unrelenting denial of God's existence. Hell can thus function in a way similar to that of the state of purgatory in Christian tradition. Though Islamic tradition does not have a separate term for that state of purification. Muslim tradition also hints at something like an intermediate state. Perhaps similar to the Christian idea of limbo.
How did Muslim history unfold after the age of the first great Caliphal dynasties?
Among the numerous dynasties and political regimes that ruled throughout the Mediterranean and Central and South Asia, several stand out. In Egypt, the Mamluk dynasty, 1250 to 1517, presided over 2.5 centuries of relative peace and prosperity throughout the central Middle East. They were patrons of the arts and architecture on a grand scale, under whom Cairo especially grew into a worthy rival of any great Mediterranean city. The Ottoman Turks, 1300 to 1921. Supplanted the Mamluks as they expanded to conquer most of the former Byzantine Empire and more. To the east, the Safavid dynasty, 1501 to 1722, replaced the descendants of Genghis Khan, who had ruled Iraq and Iran for 250 years. Establishing 12er Shia Islam, the official creed of the realm. The Safavids created splendid art and architecture in cities such as Isfahan.
What are some of the other religious days Muslims observe?
On the 15th of Shaban, many Muslims, especially in South Asia, observe the night of forgiveness, Laylat al-Bara'ah, pronounced Bara'a. Popular belief says that the names of all persons are written on the leaves of a great cosmic tree. On the evening of the 14th, the tree shakes and loses some of its leaves. Those whose leaves fall are destined to die during the coming year. According to a hadith, God comes down to the lowest heaven that night and asks if anyone seeks forgiveness. That is the moment for all to wipe the slate clean, since no one knows whether his or her leaf has fallen. Celebrations of many holy persons, often centering around the individual's tomb, vary according to region. In addition to birthday, Mawlid, and death anniversary, URS, celebrations, Muslims in various places observe seasonal times. Mawsim, with festivities connected to agricultural or other natural cycles. One such celebration is that of Nabi Musa, Prophet Moses, observed around his alleged tomb shrine near Jericho. Its timing coincides roughly with the Orthodox Christian Holy Week, featuring elaborate processions that begin in Jerusalem.
What activities do Muslims typically do in and around the mosque?
Throughout history and in many parts of the world, mosques have stood at the center of an enormous range of activities. In Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and India, for example, mosque complexes have combined educational facilities of various levels, libraries, medical schools, and hospitals, social service facilities, funerary facilities, and religious residences. Many of the monumental complexes depended on the sort of equally monumental royal patronage that is rare these days. But plans for somewhat less ambitious projects are afoot now in various parts of the United States. As local communities grow, mosque complexes will become increasingly visible. Meeting and social spaces are just the first of many needs beyond the basic requirement of a place for communal ritual prayer.
After Muhammad died and the Arab armies expanded into new territories and encountered new cultures and religious communities, the Muslims had to confront countless problems previously unknown. How would they deal with issues that neither the Quran nor the Hadith addressed?
Local Muslim leaders often had to improvise, exercising their best personal judgment and acting as they believed Muhammad would have done. They strove to perpetuate the Prophet's example, his sunnah. But authorities and leading scholars in Medina, and later in other cities, looked for ways to standardize the procedure of extending the application of Quran and Hadith to changing circumstances. They gradually agreed that one could solve problems not treated directly in Quran and Hadith by appealing to the actual practice of the local community or to the consensus ijma, pronounced ijmaa, of legal scholars. But since some questions were too new for any consensus to have developed, scholars agreed that one could apply a form of reasoning by analogy, qiyas, pronounced qyaas, that followed strict rules so as to keep the process as free of personal whim as possible. Leading legal scholars in different cities devised slightly different formulas for using the four roots of the law: Quran, Hadith, consensus, and analogical reasoning, some allowing greater latitude in appealing to the third and fourth roots. Four legal methodologies dominant among Sunni Muslims came to be called the schools, madhabs, while several other distinctively Shi'i schools eventually developed as well.
When do Muslims make pilgrimage to Mecca and what do they do there?
Formal season for the greater pilgrimage, called the Hajj, occurs between the 8th and 13th day of the 12th lunar month. The journey is required of all Muslims with sufficient health and financial resources, assuming also that making the Hajj would not require them to shirk serious family responsibilities at home. As pilgrims enter a forbidden zone that encircles Mecca, called the Haram, They put on the plain white wraps called the ihram, pronounced ihraam. The garb marks a transition to sacred space and time, and reminds pilgrims of their simple equality before God. Though precise ritual activities depend on both variations within the four Sunni law schools as well as on whether or not pilgrims intend to combine Hajj with Umrah. Lesser pilgrimage, the following offers an idea of the major elements. On the first day, the 8th of the month, they usually circumambulate the Kaaba 7 times. Pray at the station of Abraham, pray 2 cycles of prostrations, and drink from the spring of Zamzam. Heading for Mina outside of Mecca. Most pilgrims will stay overnight there before moving on to the plain of Arafat. They stand before the Mount of Mercy, recalling the deeds of Muhammad and Abraham here long ago. That evening they go a short distance back toward Mecca, to Muzdalifah, where on the 3rd day they celebrate the Feast of Sacrifice, Eid al-Adha. Moving back to Mina later that day, pilgrims cast 7 stones at one of 3 pillars. A symbolic repudiation of the temptations of Satan. After a symbolic clipping or shaving of hair, pilgrims remove the ihram and return to Mecca to circumambulate the Kaaba and run 7 times between the hills Safa and Marwa to commemorate Hagar's frantic search for water. During the 11th through 13th days, pilgrims remain at Mina, casting the remainder of 49 stones collected earlier at all 3 of the pillars. Those who did not participate in the sacrifice on the 10th day may do so now. To end the whole event, most will again circumambulate the Kaaba 7 times. In recent years the Saudi government has expanded their pilgrimage facilities dramatically in order to accommodate annual crowds now numbering 2 million or more.
Who are some of the main Islamic prophets?
Among the main Islamic prophets are Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Lot, Jacob, Noah, David, Solomon, Job, Joseph, Moses, Aaron, Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, Hud, Shu'ab, Soleh, Zachariah, John, the Baptizer, and Jesus.
Are there religious hierarchical structures in any branch of Islam?
Sunni Muslims constitute the vast majority of Islam's global membership. Since the generation that succeeded Muhammad, the dominant ideal of governance has been that a leader should be first among equals. Centuries of caliphal splendor might persuade a student of history that a type of monarchy was the preferred form of Islamic governance. In practice, many of the most powerful Muslim rulers over the centuries have at least tried to call the shots religiously as well as politically. Nevertheless, Sunni Islam has never evolved quite the kind of hierarchical structure found, for example, in Roman Catholicism. Muslim authority structures in various countries and regions often take the form of councils of religious or legal scholars, or of imams. In practice, jurisdiction in matters of religious law and discipline is limited generally to the confines of modern nation-states. Following a very different model, the largest branch of Shia Islam, Twelver or Imamite Shi'ism, has evolved a much more centralized authority structure. As a result of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers sought to replace a monarchy with a theocracy. They established a pyramidal hierarchy of religious authority with Khomeini at the top. He was the most influential of a number of leading Ayatollahs. Sign of God, and won the title Imam by virtue of his dominance. Below him was a cluster of grand Ayatollahs and a larger group of lesser Ayatollahs. Just beneath them were two ranks of religious scholars with the title Hujjatul Islam, Proof of Islam, and finally the several thousand mullahs. From a word that means roughly master, reverend, who staffed the country's mosques.
Are there any organizations or institutions that have their own distinctive structures of leadership within any of the branches of Islam?
Beginning in early medieval times, groups of Muslims throughout the Middle East coalesced informally around individuals reputed for their holiness. At first the groups typically gathered at the home of the sheikh, or sheikhika, since some were women, to pray and listen to the teacher's reflections on sacred texts and topics. As they grew, these groups often found they needed larger spaces in which to meet. Some members also felt the need for a more permanent form of membership. As years went on and the central holy persons aged and died, the question of succession in leadership also arose. Eventually these groups became more highly organized and established formal courses of training. Their rules or charters often reflected highly structured membership with various ranks and offices. And they developed distinctive types of buildings combining prayer and devotional space, residences for the administrators and ordinary members, and often social services facilities as well. These organizations came to be called tariqas, pronounced ta-reeka. Analogous in some ways to the religious orders so important in the Christian, Buddhist, and other traditions.
Is there an Islamic creed?
One short, two-part statement sums up the essentials of Muslim belief. I confess that there is no deity but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. In this testimony called the Shahada, confession or witnessing, Muslims affirm the two foundational elements from which all other beliefs and practices flow. First, they assert that only the one, transcendent, Supreme Being called Allah in Arabic can claim the full allegiance of humankind. Allah means literally the deity, or what ordinary English usage calls God with a capital G. Allah is therefore not a distinct name for God as such, but the primary designation for the Absolute. The deity above all other powers both spiritual and worldly. Affirming God's absolute oneness is called Tawhid, pronounced Tawheed, second. Muslims attest that human beings know of the Supreme Being through the agency of prophets, the last of whom was Muhammad. This profession of faith is the first of the 5 pillars of Islam. Along with almsgiving, daily ritual prayer, fasting during Ramadan pronounced Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca. All of which will be discussed later in detail. Muslim religious scholars between about 750 and 950 formulated a number of other, more detailed creedal statements. But none has been as widely known as the Nicene Creed among Christians or the 13 Articles among Jews. Those later Islamic creeds developed largely as correctives to theological positions that arose during Islam's early centuries, views that the creeds formally repudiated as unacceptable.
What were traditional criminal sanctions?
Within the sphere of penal law, death is warranted for apostasy and for highway robbery. Amputation of the hand for theft, death by stoning for sexual relations outside of marriage when the offender is married, and 100 lashes if the offender is unmarried. And 80 lashes for the drinking of an intoxicant or for an unproved accusation of unchastity. Civil offenses against the person, homicide, for example, or assault, are punishable by retaliation, with the offender subjected to the same treatment as the victim. In such civil cases, only the victim or his family has the right to prosecute, since the crime is not considered to be against the state. Often, the victim will choose monetary compensation, diya, blood money, in place of retaliation. Few predominantly Muslim societies today enact the traditional penalties as originally enjoined.
Are there characteristically Muslim views about how religion and political power come together?
Muslims often describe their tradition as a total way of life. A comprehensive approach that goes far beyond mere ritual observance or showing up at the mosque once a week. Some believe that such an all-encompassing teaching must ultimately be expressed in political terms. Referring to early Muslim community life under the Prophet's leadership in Medina as the ideal. Throughout history, Muslims have experimented with various models for balancing or integrating religious and civil authority. Some have worked well enough, allowing for freedom of religious practice and expression among members of religious minorities under Muslim rule. In fact, the historical record suggests that Muslims have been at least as successful as any other group at administering religiously sponsored regimes fairly and even-handedly. Muslims in various parts of the world today continue to believe that an Islamic government represents the best hope of justice in a troubled world. But in a world where religious pluralism is increasingly evident, dividing humankind along religious lines seems a less than desirable option. The challenge now, as in the past, is to live by the Quranic dictum, there is no compulsion in religion.
Do Muslim communities run private schools for their children?
A tradition of Islamic religious education began many centuries ago. Younger children attended a Quran school called a kutab, pronounced kutaab. They might progress to more advanced studies in hadith, and eventually to the equivalent of modern-day higher education provided in institutions called madrasas. Students in a madrasa, pronounced madrasa, pursue a curriculum built around the teaching of one of the legal methodologies, madhabs, pronounced madhab, and eventually receive credentials, a kind of license, as professional religious scholars. Many mosques in the United States are continuing that tradition by establishing primary and, increasingly, secondary schools in which religious education is prominent. Along with the regular course of studies required by state and local accreditation authorities. Children study basic Quranic, Arabic and related Islamic topics such as religious history and ritual practice. Students who attend public or other schools may attend special weekend religious education sessions at the local mosque.
What means do Muslim communities use to engage society at large?
In addition to the various forms of charitable giving, an important traditional device within Islamic law has had an enormous impact on life in many Islamic communities throughout history. A waqf is a special religious endowment by which a donor can stipulate that his or her funds be used for a particular project in perpetuity, or as long as the funds last. All over the Middle East and Southern Asia. For example, scores of these dedicated trust funds, established centuries ago, remain in force, administered by members of particular families or by government officials entrusted with a specific mandate for the oversight of the endowments. Many endowments historically have been funded by royalty, but a significant number are supported by the generosity of other wealthy individuals or even collectives of many devout individuals. Trusts remain an important matter today, and many Muslims are devising other ways in which concerned fellow believers can contribute to endowments supporting important communal projects.
Does the beginning of the Muslim year have any particular significance?
During the first 10 days of the month of Muharram, Muslims reflect on a variety of spiritual themes. During Muhammad's time, the community observed a one-day fast on the 10th of the month. Ashura, pronounced Aashora. Possibly paralleling the Jewish practice of fasting on the 10th of Tishri, generally known as Yom Kippur. Though the major fast was formally shifted to Ramadan. Muslims still observe this day, some with fasting and special prayer. Like many holy days, Ashura has become associated with ancient events of great significance. This day marks the day on which Noah left the ark. Visitors to Mecca can enter the Kaaba itself, not just the sanctuary around it, on this day alone. But the first 10 days of the year are still more important for Shia Muslims. Some readers may recall the day in 1979 when Iranian students took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It occurred on the 1st of Muharram in the year 1400 after the Hijra, the beginning of the traditional period of mourning for the proto-martyr Hussein, who died at the hands of a tyrannical ruler in the year 680 CE. Observance of the sad event gains in intensity until the actual day of martyrdom. Some observing a fast on the 9th day. On Ashura itself, some Shiites make pilgrimages to Karbala in Iraq, site of the martyrdom, or to the tombs of other imams in Iran and Iraq. In more traditional Shia villages, people still gather to reenact the events in a passion play called the Taziyah, pronounced Taziyah. Looking at the bigger picture, a hadith says that at the beginning of each new century, on the lunar Islamic calendar, God will raise up for the Muslim community a renewer who will call all believers to a fuller participation in the faith.
What's the difference between a prophet and a messenger?
Central to Islamic tradition is the belief that God communicates ultimate truths through specially chosen persons called prophets. Without prophetic revelation, human beings would be forced to rely on intellect alone, and thus could not arrive at the knowledge necessary to attain their final purpose. Every prophet, Nabi, pronounced Nabi, passes along the divine word to a particular people and inevitably meets with tremendous resistance, at least initially. Some of these prophets receive the further designation of messenger or apostle. Rasul, pronounced Rasul, one who is sent. God sends but one messenger to a given people. Prophets specified as messengers include Noah, Lot, Ishmael, Moses, Shu'ab, Hud, Saleh, Jesus, and of course Muhammad. Prophets preach and warn their people. But messengers are also commissioned to lead a community of faith called an ummah. Post-Quranic tradition also teaches that messengers function as lawgivers, whereas the other prophets do not. In short, one might say that all messengers are prophets, but not all prophets are messengers.
Is there such a thing as heresy in Islamic tradition?
Muslim tradition recognizes varying degrees of deviation from pure faith or iman, iman. Certain forms of departure from strict Quranic teaching and practices clearly identified as deriving from the Sunnah of the Prophet have been labeled innovation, bid'ah. Some things once considered innovations, such as attaching minarets to mosques, have long since become widely accepted. All but today's most traditionally minded Muslims give little consideration to this category. A daily danger for all human beings, one that Muslims seek to combat constantly, is called shirk, or associating partners with God. Any undue attention or attachment to that which is not God is thus a form of shirk. But while it is a natural tendency, it is not necessarily a permanent condition unless one chooses to make it so. A more serious problem, known technically as deviation, ilhad, comes closer to what many understand by the term heresy. A mulhid is someone who deliberately strays from the broadly accepted tenets of the faith, introducing innovations to the extent that one can no longer readily recognize basic Islamic teachings in the new formulation. Farthest from adherence to true belief is the category of kafir, the kind of willful unbelief that leads to outright blasphemy.
Do Muslims celebrate events in connection with any other religious figures?
Popular practice in many places still includes annual commemorations of birthdays and death anniversaries of various important holy persons and friends of God. Birthday celebrations of members of the Prophet's family, such as Sayyidah Zainab, remain popular in places like Egypt. Lasting for up to 7 days, the festivities are like sprawling street parties. Crowds grow daily, as does the intensity of the celebration. Vendors sell food and souvenirs, and Quran reciters fill the air with sacred sounds from their booths up and down the streets. Mosques within the central area of celebration can be packed to overflowing. Birthdays of famous friends of God frequently include recitation of classic poems extolling the saints' spiritual achievements and glorious intimacy with God. Anniversaries of the death of God's special friends are also important in many regions, especially those further to the east, since holy persons are fully united with God at death. The occasions are sometimes referred to as the Saint's Wedding Day, URS, pronounced OORS. On the 6th of Rajab, many Indian Muslims, and members of other faiths as well, observe the URS of Mu'in ad-Din Kishti, founder of a famous Sufi order, at his tomb in the city of Ajmer.
Is there a central teaching authority for Muslims?
No single individual or institution has universal authority over the global Islamic community. For Sunni Muslims, the nearest approximation to centralized teaching authorities are religiously affiliated Educational institutions in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, venerable and influential for very different reasons. Cairo's Al-Azhar, founded in 972 by the Ismaili, Sevener Shiite, Fatimid dynasty, has worn the mantle of religious prestige and authoritative conservatism since it was converted by Saladin and his dynasty. After 1171, for the task of defending the cause of Sunni Islam. In Saudi Arabia, educational institutions of Mecca and Medina have come to share in Al-Azhar's prestige in modern times. Young men seeking careers in religious studies come from all over the world, looking forward to returning home with credentials from these institutions. Nowadays, a senior jurist somewhere might on very rare occasions issue a legal advisory fatwa, claiming universal force, so that every Muslim ought to abide by it. The Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, delivered an order that Salman Rushdie was liable to the death penalty for blasphemy. And Osama bin Laden has called for a jihad against the United States. But rare claims of that sort do not have the binding authority of a centralized institution like the papacy. In various parts of the world, religious scholars join together for consultative purposes. In the United States, for example, a council of imams holds regular gatherings to discuss practical and pastoral problems that arise in local communities. Elsewhere, muftis in a given region sometimes submit their decisions to the further judgment of a grand mufti, who exercises special jurisdiction in religious matters.
Why do Jews, Christians, and Muslims all claim the same Holy Land?
Palestine lies in Southwest Asia at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. It is the Holy Land of Jews, since it was here that Moses led the Israelites after he led them out of slavery in Egypt and where they subsequently established their homeland, of Christians. Since it is where Jesus Christ was born, lived, and died, and of Muslims. Since the Arab people conquered Palestine in the 7th century and, except for a brief period during the Crusades, it was ruled by various Muslim dynasties until 1516, when it became part of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine, which covers an area of just over 10,000 square miles, is roughly the size of Maryland. Palestine's capital, Jerusalem, is also claimed as a holy city by all three religions. Jews call it the City of David, or the City of the Great King, since it was made the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel around 1000 BCE. Christians regard it as holy since Jesus traveled with his disciples to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. It is the site of the Last Supper, and just outside the city, at Golgotha, Jesus was crucified, c. 30. Muslim Arabs captured the city in 638, just after Muhammad's death. And, like the rest of Palestine, it has a long history of Muslim Arab rule. Jerusalem, which is now part of the modern state of Israel, is home to numerous synagogues, churches, and mosques. It also has been the site of numerous religious conflicts throughout history.
Why do Muslims bury their dead so quickly?
Although there's no time limit, most Muslims are buried within 24 hours of their death. The tradition originated out of the practical need to keep bodies from deteriorating in the Middle Eastern heat. Although many Muslims now live in countries where technology allows bodies to be preserved, most avoid embalming, because they believe it violates the dignity of the deceased. For the very same reason, Muslims don't believe in displaying a body as is common at many Christian funerals.
What does the term revelation mean in Islamic tradition?
Islam's scripture, the Quran, consistently refers to itself as the word that God has sent down. Tanzil, pronounced Tanzeel, to humankind through Muhammad. That which is sent down represents a manifestation of truths that have existed from all eternity in the heavenly archetype of the Quran known as the mother of the book. God reveals by communicating in a language understandable to the intended audience. Both the Quran and subsequent Muslim tradition describe the actual process of revelation by a technical term, wahy, that distinguishes prophetic revelation from the kinds of inspiration that animate holy persons and artists, for example. The prophetic intermediary hears the message, not with physical ears but with the ears of the spirit and heart. Some descriptions of revelation suggest a visionary dimension as well, as when the angel Gabriel or another mysterious unnamed presence appears. According to both Quran and Hadith, Muhammad received revelations in a wide variety of circumstances. In some cases revelation is given in response to a particular question asked of the Prophet. In others, Muhammad is described as praying, preaching, eating, or even bathing. Muhammad is said to have experienced a variety of actual sensations when he received a revelation. He spoke of a sound like bees humming around his face, or a loud bell, the sound of which was physically painful. Sometimes he broke into a cold sweat or showed signs like those of a trance or seizure. All of the prophets are said to have experienced similar forms of revelation. What is most significant here is Muhammad's overwhelming sense of the divine presence at these moments.
What do Muslims believe about God?
God is one, transcendent, and wholly unlike anything in ordinary human experience. But such a bare-bones description of ultimate reality leaves little for the human heart to grasp. Muslim tradition speaks of God most of all through the 99 beautiful names. Compassionate and merciful are by far the most important of these. They occur in the phrase "in the name of God, the compassionate." the merciful, with which all but one of the surahs of the Quran begin. Whatever devout Muslims do, they dedicate with that phrase. God's names include about equally those that suggest divine power and majesty, Jalal, pronounced Jalaal, and those that speak of his beauty and infinite attractiveness, Jamal, pronounced Jamal. God both brings to life and causes to die, gives freely and calls all creation to account. Non-Muslims often have the mistaken impression that the Islamic God is most of all a fearsome, even despotic, power before whom all must cower and cringe. To the contrary, while Muslims are ever aware of God's uncontested sovereignty and dominion over all things, they believe as well that, as the Quran teaches, God is closer to individual persons than even their jugular vein. Muslim tradition reminds believers that, in the end, God's mercy outweighs his anger. Scores of hadiths describe this God of mercy in such beautiful and moving terms that any outsider who studies them can readily understand why so many Muslims find devotion to such a deity so compelling.
How does this system of religious law work?
Some legal specialists rise to greater prominence because of their erudition, earning the title mujtahid. Pronounced mujtahid, one who exercises independent investigation of the sacred sources. In Sunni tradition, the door of independent investigation closed by the year 900. Making further bold scholarship of this level unnecessary. According to that classical view, the founders of the four major Sunni schools of legal theory were the last mujtahids. But in Shi'i tradition, the highest-ranking ayatollahs continue to exercise the authority of mujtahids. In both traditions, it is up to scholars to offer rulings on controversial or contemporary issues. If a new ethical and legal question arises, a question of artificial life support or some other thorny biomedical matter, for example, a legal scholar would search the relevant sources to determine whether the Quran or Hadith might shed light on the precise issue at hand. If the scholar found only vague parallels that offer insufficient evidence to make a firm ruling on the new problem, he would then study further to see whether in the actual practice of Muslim communities there was an approach that might solve the problem. If the problem is too new to have any kind of useful history, the scholar might appeal to reasoning by analogy, looking for a link between ancient sources and practice and the new problem. Ancient sources may say nothing about artificial life support, but they have much to say about the nature of human life and about human authority to intervene. On the basis of his research, the scholar might then issue a legal advisory called a fatwa. In that statement he would indicate to which of 5 ethico-legal categories the proposed course of action, say, disconnecting life support in a particular case, belonged, forbidden, discouraged, neutral, recommended, or required. Acting upon the advisory, the parties to the case might then choose to bring the matter before a religious judge called a qadi, pronounced Qaadi, himself authorized as a mufti, to adjudicate the matter. The outcome of all this study and interpretation is called Sharia, pronounced Shari'ah. The divinely revealed law or way of life prescribed for all Muslims.
What are the 5 pillars of faith for Muslims?
Muslims practice adherence to the 5 pillars of faith. 1. Profession of belief in Allah as the only God and Muhammad as his prophet. 2. Ritual prayer 5 times daily at dawn, at noon, in the afternoon, in the evening, and at nightfall. 3. Giving alms to the poor. 4. Fasting from dawn until dusk during the holy month of Ramadan. And 5. Making the pilgrimage, Hajj, to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Muslims?
Islamic tradition centers on the relatively compact body of beliefs summed up in the Shahada. Straightforward affirmation of God's unity and transcendence, and divine communication through a succession of prophet messengers, are the core of doctrine. Further basic elements that flow from these core doctrines include, especially, belief in God's use of angels as helpers and guides, resurrection of the body, personal accountability at judgment, and ultimate reward or punishment in heaven or hell in the next world. Since there is no central teaching authority, Muslims do not think in terms of official, dogmatic formulations of their beliefs. Simplicity is the key. So long as one prefaces every act of faith with proper intention, one can be assured of pursuing the path God has revealed. In other words, Islamic tradition emphasizes orthopraxy over orthodoxy.
Do Muslims ever visit their holy cities outside of the formal pilgrimage season?
Hajj, or major pilgrimage, fulfills a religious duty only in connection with the formal season. But travelers to the holy city can perform the Umrah or lesser pilgrimage any time of year. Umrah is a strictly devotional activity, optional but highly recommended. Rituals include a much scaled-down version of important Hajj activities. To be more precise, Umrah is actually a component of Hajj that can be performed separately. Pilgrims enter into the state of ritual consecration by donning the same seamless white cloth worn for Hajj. Before entering the sacred zone surrounding Mecca, they proceed to the Kaaba, circumambulate it 7 times, perform 2 cycles of ritual prayer, take a drink from the well of Zamzam, and walk rapidly 7 times between the small hillocks called Marwa and Safa. They conclude the lesser pilgrimage by clipping a lock of hair or shaving the head, symbolizing the spiritual change desired as a result of the pilgrimage. As at Hajj time, many pilgrims add a visit to the Prophet's mosque in Medina. but that is a separate devotional activity.
Is there a standard Islamic group liturgical worship?
Islamic ritual prayer, performed 5 times daily, is called salat, from a root that means to make holy. Whenever Muslims gather, they perform the ritual prayer together. That applies not only to the prescribed Friday midday congregational prayer but to any of the set times at which 2 or more Muslims come together any day of the week, whether in the mosque or elsewhere. As with all Muslim ritual practice, worshippers preface this prayer with the clearly stated intention. Niyya, pronounced N-E-I-A, saying I intend to pray the dawn, for example, salat. From 2 to 4 cycles of standing, bowing to place hands on knees, ruku, pronounced rukoo. Sitting on the heels, jalsa, pronounced jalsa, stretching forward toward prostration. Sajda, pronounced sajda, to place hands flat on the floor at shoulder width. And touching the forehead to the floor, make up the fundamental salat ritual. The number of cycles, rak'ah, pronounced rak'ah, depends on which prescribed prayer one is performing.
Do Muslims engage in any specific purification rituals?
Prior to each act of ritual prayer, Muslims perform a brief purification called wudu, pronounced wudu. Worshippers perform each of the following cleansing motions 3 times, rinse hands and wrists. Rinse out the mouth, then the nostrils likewise, rinse the whole face. Arms up to the elbows, whole head and neck, and finally toes and feet up to the ankles. Mosques today typically provide separate facilities in which men and women can perform the ablution. Older mosques often have fountains or taps running along an exterior wall, with small benches or stools for worshippers to sit on. They usually use tap water, but under peculiar circumstances even sand or earth is acceptable, in which case it is called tayammum, pronounced tawayyum. Clearly the idea is to prepare oneself symbolically to enter a special state of mindfulness. In addition to this cleansing, Muslims also regard a more thorough bathing, called ghusl, essential to restore the state of ritual purity after sexual intercourse, seminal discharge, or the menstrual cycle. Ghusl includes the motions of the ablution just described, but encompasses the entire body as well. The intent of these rituals is to put the individual in a state of maximum attentiveness to and spiritual worthiness for entering into the presence of God.
Do Muslims believe in miracles?
Muhammad's early critics in Mecca sometimes taunted him for being so much like an ordinary human being. If he were really a prophet of God, surely he would entertain them with some sort of heavenly pyrotechnics. Muhammad regarded the Quran itself as his only miracle. A marvel of eloquence uttered by a man considered technically unlettered. But the scripture does refer often to spectacular signs God brought about to vindicate earlier prophets. For example, Moses' staff became a dragon that devoured Pharaoh's magicians. And Moses' hand turned white with leprosy and was then restored to health. Quran 7:107-08. Within a generation or two of Muhammad's death, tradition had begun to attribute to the prophet a number of extraordinary occurrences. He could fast for inordinately long periods, could see people behind him, heal various ailments, supply water where there was none, and stretch limited food sources as needed. Trees and stones saluted Muhammad, a pillar in his house mourned that the prophet no longer leaned on it when he preached. And the prophet split the moon in two to confound his critics. Throughout the history of Islam, holy persons called friends of God have been famous for the ability to perform wondrous deeds. Many Muslims today regard accounts of such legend and lore of secondary importance. Classical Muslim theologians devised technical terms to distinguish between two levels of miracle. They called the works God did as proof of his prophet's truthfulness evidentiary miracles, mu'jizat. Pronounced mu'jizaat, and those effected by friends of God marvels, karamat, pronounced karamaat. Theologians further called attention to key differences between works of sorcery and wonders performed authentically under divine power.
What is the importance of the month of Ramadan?
During pre-Islamic times, the month called Ramadan, high summer, was religiously significant as a time during which the Arab tribes observed a truce from all hostilities. Of all the months, the Quran mentions only Ramadan by name, identifying it as the month during which the scripture was revealed. Scripture suggests that the initial divine revelation is the reason for the practice of fasting throughout the month. Ramadan begins with the sighting of the new moon on the last night of the 8th month. Each day, from dawn until sunset, Muslims are enjoined to fast from all food and liquid, as well as from sexual activity and other forms of sensual pleasure. Fasting also means refraining from negative attitudes and complaining, and developing a sense of solidarity with those who suffer from want all year long. After Muslims break the fast with some water and dates, they eat a meal before retiring. Before dawn they may have another meal, but limit other forms of celebration during the entire month. Special prayers are scheduled in mosques, along with the recitation of one of 30 sections of the Quran, completing the entire sacred text over the 30 nights. A number of important dates fall during Ramadan. Most important is the Night of Power, one of the odd-numbered nights among the last 10, usually observed on the 27th. Muslims believe that God's initial revelation to Muhammad makes this the holiest time of the entire year. Other important times during Ramadan include the birthday of the martyr Hussein, 6th, death of Muhammad's first wife, Khadija, 10th, the Battle of Badr, a key event in 625, the 17th, the retaking of Mecca in 630, 19th. The deaths of Ali and of the 8th Shia Imam, Ali Reza, 21st, and Ali's birthday, 22nd. Where Muslims are in the majority or a very sizable minority. The rhythm of life slows dramatically during Ramadan. At the sighting of the next new moon, all rejoice in the feast of fast-breaking, Eid al-Fitr.
Are there any other forms of religious pilgrimage?
Ziyara, pronounced Zyara, meaning visitation, is a form of minor pilgrimage still popular all over the world. With a few regional exceptions such as the Arabian Peninsula. Devout Muslims travel to the tombs of holy persons to receive barakah. Blessings, by association with the saint's power and holiness. Elaborate shrine complexes have grown up around some of these sacred sites. Since the 19th century especially, Muslim authorities in Saudi Arabia have sought to stamp out the practice because they have deemed the veneration of miracle-working saints a threat to pure monotheism. Ironically, Saudi Arabia remains the home of the prime example of Ziyara. Each year millions of pilgrims to Mecca make a special trip north to Medina to visit the mosque in which Muhammad, his daughter Fatima, and the first caliph, Abu Bakr, are buried. Sunni Muslims from Morocco to Malaysia continue to visit secondary holy places, most of which are graves of Sufi sheikhs. Shi'i Muslims also visit sites connected with similar friends of God. But their devotional travel revolves more around a number of distinctively Shiite holy places. They are the tombs of the Imams, spiritual and biological descendants of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima. Most of the Imams' shrines are in Iran, with its overwhelmingly Shi'i population, and southern Iraq, where most of that country's slight majority of Shiites live.
Are any occasions associated with Muhammad especially important?
Since medieval times, Muslims in many countries have celebrated Muhammad's birthday, Mawlid an-Nabi, on the 12th of Rabi'i. Street parties and grand banquets often provide opportunity for special prayers and speeches. A very popular part of the festivities is the recitation of a poem by the 13th century Egyptian poet Bizari, the Burda, pronounced Biyurda, mantle. Translated into Swahili and a number of other languages. The poem sings the Prophet's praises in truly cosmic terms, attributing to his birth all manner of marvels and blessings. In some places, where festivities are minimized or forbidden altogether, even the Prophet's birthday is a kind of national holiday. On the 27th of Rajab, Muslims recall the night journey and ascension, Laylat al-Isra wal Miraj. According to traditional accounts, The Prophet experienced this timeless mystical moment sometime during the years just before the Hijrah. A major feature of the celebrations is the retelling of any of several narratives that follow. Gabriel and Muhammad through the heavens, including descriptions of his meetings and conversations with the other major prophets, each associated with one of the 7 celestial levels. During the course of his journey, Muhammad received special instructions about instituting the 5 daily ritual prayers.
Was Islam especially important in medieval Spain?
Not long after Arab troops began to occupy the Iberian Peninsula, Muslim princes, called amirs, literally commanders, pronounced emir, established themselves in major cities. In 750 the Abbasids sought to put an end to their Umayyad rivals by assassinating all of the family's princes. One managed to escape and take refuge in Spain. This Abdar Rahman proclaimed himself Amir of Córdoba, still holding aloft the Umayyad standard. His successors eventually broke with Baghdad definitively by proclaiming the Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba. A major step up from an Amirate, the Caliphate laid claim to the universal allegiance of all Muslims. For several centuries Córdoba would be a marvel of cultural splendor and interreligious harmony. On the whole, Córdoba was an outstanding example of how Jews, Christians, and Muslims could live together in peace under Muslim rule. Islam's presence was highly visible in other Spanish cities as well. Seville became an important political and cultural center. As Córdoba receded in importance in the mid-11th century, Christian reconquest of Spain gradually retook ground from Muslim rule, from Toledo to Córdoba to Seville. Granada would remain the last stronghold of Islam until the armies of Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella took the legendary Alhambra in 1492. Nearly 8 centuries of Islamic presence in Spain left a rich religious and cultural heritage. 500 years after the fall of Granada, small communities of Muslims are once again taking root in Spain.
How did Islam become important in southern Asia?
Further east than Iraq and Iran, the Mughal dynasty, 1502 to 1757, established Islamic rule over much of South Asia. From Afghanistan across at least the northern two-thirds of India. Great monarchs such as Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan turned cities like Delhi and Agra into architectural showpieces with works like the Taj Mahal. After about the mid-18th century, European colonialism began to make inroads into lands formerly under Islamic regimes. Not until the mid-20th century did major colonial powers begin to withdraw, ceding political control back to indigenous populations. One dramatic example of that relatively recent change is the independence of India from Britain and the partition of India that created the Muslim state of Pakistan. 1948, itself divided in 1971 into Pakistan and Bangladesh.
What is an Ayatollah?
Ayatollah is Arabic for sign of God. An honorific title conferred on leading Shiite religious scholars, especially in Iran and Iraq. In traditional Shiite circles, accomplished scholars can attain the rank of Ayatollah by popular acclaim and through the acknowledgement of their peers. Among those of that rank, some are also further distinguished by the title Grand Ayatollah. Of those, in turn, a group of 7 have traditionally been singled out as sources of imitation and are thereby acknowledged as the most influential teachers among Shiite Muslims.
What are Muslim sermons like?
An address called the khutbah, pronounced khutbah, is a standard feature of every Friday congregational prayer service. Members of the congregation sit on the floor while the preacher stands near the niche, mihrab, or ascends a few steps of a pulpit called the minbar, pronounced minbar. In larger, more established mosques, the imam generally delivers the sermon on Fridays at the early afternoon congregational prayer. But either the imam or some other adult might also offer some reflections at other times when smaller groups gather for salat. Speakers have a wide range of appropriate topics from which to choose. High on the list are ethical concerns such as social responsibility, the need for parents to take an active part in their children's education, and speaking out in public venues about problems that need attention from concerned citizens. Speakers might also choose any of scores of devotional themes, such as cultivating one's relationship with God, or the need to set aside time for personal reading and reflection on the Quran. Preachers often tailor their sermons to a specific religious season, especially during Ramadan and pilgrimage season. Encouragement during the month-long fast is always helpful and welcome. Scripture naturally plays a major part in sermons, and preachers generally cite hadiths along with Quranic texts to illustrate their themes. Sermons vary in length from 5 or 10 minutes to perhaps a half hour for special occasions.
What are Muslim sermons like?
An address called the khutbah, pronounced khutbah, is a standard feature of every Friday congregational prayer service. Members of the congregation sit on the floor while the preacher stands near the niche, mihrab, or ascends a few steps of a pulpit called the minbar, pronounced minbar. In larger, more established mosques, The Imam generally delivers the sermon on Fridays at the early afternoon congregational prayer. But either the Imam or some other adult might also offer some reflections at other times when smaller groups gather for salat. Speakers have a wide range of appropriate topics from which to choose. High on the list are ethical concerns such as social responsibility, the need for parents to take an active part in their children's education, and speaking out in public venues about problems that need attention from concerned citizens. Speakers might also choose any of scores of devotional themes, such as cultivating one's relationship with God, or the need to set aside time for personal reading and reflection on the Quran. Preachers often tailor their sermons to a specific religious season, especially during Ramadan and pilgrimage season. Encouragement during the month-long fast is always helpful and welcome. Scripture naturally plays a major part in sermons, and preachers generally cite hadiths along with Quranic texts to illustrate their themes. Sermons vary in length from 5 or 10 minutes to perhaps a half hour for special occasions.